What happens when Hollywood's most beloved superstar meets late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when a simple promotional interview turns into an explosive confrontation that has the entire entertainment industry talking. This isn't just another celebrity spat. This is the moment when Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, known for his unshakable composure and diplomatic nature, finally reached his breaking point on live television. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two titans of entertainment clash in the most unexpected way possible. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live started. Like any other promotional appearance, Dwayne Johnson, fresh off his latest blockbuster success, was scheduled for what should have been a lighthearted conversation about his upcoming projects and philanthropic endeavors. The audience was primed for the usual charm offensive: Johnson's infectious smile, his trademark humility, and those heartwarming stories about his family that have made him America's favorite action star. But from the moment Johnson walked onto that stage, something felt different. Kimmel's usual gregarious demeanor seemed forced, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. The audience sensed it too, that subtle shift in energy that happens when two people who clearly have unresolved issues are forced to share the same space under the hot studio lights. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only Dwayne Johnson, Kimmel announced with his trademark enthusiasm. But veteran observers of the show noticed something off in his delivery. Johnson emerged from behind the curtain with his characteristic wave and million-dollar smile. But those who knew him well could detect a tension in his shoulders, a slight tightness around his eyes that suggested this wasn't going to be the typical feel-good interview. The handshake between host and guest lasted a fraction too long, with both men maintaining eye contact that seemed more like a stare-down than a greeting. Johnson settled into the guest chair with his usual grace, but there was an undeniable undercurrent of electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the studio lighting. "So, Dwayne, great to have you back on the show," Kimmel began, his tone carrying just a hint of something that could have been interpreted as condescension. "I have to say, you've been quite busy lately. Movies, business ventures, and of course all that political speculation that seems to follow you everywhere." Johnson's response was measured, professional, but those watching closely could see his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Thanks for having me, Jimmy. Yeah, it's been a productive year. I'm grateful for all the opportunities and the chance to connect with fans around the world." "Connect with fans," Kimmel repeated, leaning back in his chair with a slight smirk. "That's interesting phrasing. Some might say you've been connecting with more than just fans lately. Word around town is you've been having some interesting conversations with some very influential people." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Johnson's public relations team, watching from the wings, exchanged worried glances. This wasn't the direction they had discussed in pre-interview meetings. The prepared talking points about Johnson's latest film, his production company, and his upcoming projects suddenly seemed irrelevant. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, Jimmy," Johnson replied, his voice maintaining its characteristic warmth but with an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "I talk to a lot of people in a lot of different industries. That's part of business." Kimmel's grin widened, but it wasn't the friendly expression his audience was accustomed to seeing. "Oh, come on, Dwayne. We're all friends here. I think the audience would be interested to hear about some of the conversations you've been having about potentially running for office. Presidential office, specifically." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Johnson had been fielding political speculation for years, always deflecting with humor and humility. But tonight felt different. Tonight, Kimmel wasn't asking. He was probing, pushing, testing boundaries that had previously been respected in the entertainment industry's unwritten code of conduct. "I've been pretty clear about my position on that," Johnson said, his smile becoming more forced. "I'm focused on my work, my family, and the projects that matter to me. If that ever changes, I'll be the first to let people know. But that's the thing, Kimmel pressed, clearly not satisfied with the diplomatic response. You haven't been clear, have you? You've been playing this game of maybe yes, maybe no, keeping everyone guessing while you build your brand and your political capital. Some might call that calculated. The word calculated hit like a physical blow. Johnson's reputation was built on authenticity, on being the genuine article in an industry full of manufactured personas. To suggest that his political coyness was somehow manipulative struck at the very core of his public image. "I think you might be reading too much into things, Jimmy," Johnson replied, but his voice had lost its warmth entirely. "I've always been straightforward with people about my intentions and my goals." "Have you, though?" Kimmel shot back, his tone now openly confrontational. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been playing both sides of every issue, making sure you never offend anyone, never take a real stand on anything controversial. That's not authenticity. That's politics." The audience, which had been eagerly anticipating their usual dose of celebrity banter and promotional material, found themselves witnessing something entirely different. This wasn't the playful ribbing that characterized most late-night television interviews. This was a direct attack on a guest's character, delivered with the kind of calculated precision that suggested it had been planned well in advance. Johnson's hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests of his chair, now gripped them tightly. His famous composure was being tested in a way that few had ever seen, and the millions of viewers watching at home could sense that something significant was about to happen. "I think we should probably move on to talking about the movie," Johnson suggested, his voice carrying a warning that anyone who knew him would recognize as a final attempt at diplomacy. But Kimmel wasn't finished. In fact, he was just getting started, and what came next would push their confrontation to a point from which there would be no return. "Actually, let's stay on this topic for a minute," Kimmel said, his voice taking on that mock-serious tone that his regular viewers knew meant he was about to go for the jugular. "Because I think there's something really interesting happening here, and I don't think we should just brush it under the rug like we always do with celebrities who want to have their cake and eat it too." The studio audience, initially confused by the departure from typical late-night fare, was now entirely silent. Even the usually chatty crowd seemed to understand they were witnessing something unprecedented. Johnson's team behind the cameras was frantically trying to get the attention of the show's producers, but Kimmel was in full control of his domain, and he wasn't about to be derailed. "You see, Dwayne," Kimmel continued, leaning forward in his chair with the predatory focus of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, "I've been watching your career for years, and I've noticed something fascinating. You've managed to become everyone's favorite action star without ever really standing for anything. You're pro-military, but you've never served. You talk about family values, but you've been divorced. You present yourself as this humble, grateful guy, but you've built a billion-dollar empire." Johnson's face had gone completely stone-faced, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck were visibly straining. "Jimmy, I think you're crossing a line here." "Am I?" Kimmel shot back, his voice dripping with mock innocence. "Because I thought this was supposed to be an interview. You know, where I ask questions and you answer them honestly instead of giving me the same polished, focus-grouped responses you give everyone else." "I've always been honest about my life and my mistakes," Johnson replied, his voice now carrying an edge that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I've never pretended to be perfect, and I've never claimed to be anything other than what I am." "But that's exactly my point," Kimmel exclaimed, slapping his hand on his desk for emphasis. "What are you exactly? Because from where I'm sitting, you're a brand. You're a carefully constructed image designed to appeal to the largest possible demographic. You're the human equivalent of vanilla ice cream. Inoffensive, palatable to everyone, but ultimately pretty bland when you really think about it." The insult landed like a physical blow. Johnson had built his entire post-wrestling career on the foundation of authenticity, on being the rare Hollywood figure who remained genuine despite massive success. To have that core identity attacked so publicly, so brutally, was clearly having an effect that went far beyond professional embarrassment. "I think you need to be careful about how you talk to your guests, Jimmy," Johnson said, his voice now carrying a warning that anyone who had ever seen him in action knew meant serious business, especially when you're making assumptions about people you don't actually know. "Don't know you?" Kimmel laughed, but it was a harsh, mocking sound. "Dwayne, I've been in this business for 20 years. I've interviewed hundreds of celebrities, and I can spot manufactured authenticity from a mile away. You're good at it. I'll give you that. Really good. But you're not fooling everyone." The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Johnson's hands were now gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His breathing was visibly controlled, the kind of deliberate respiration that suggested a man fighting to maintain his composure against overwhelming provocation. "You want to know what I think?" Kimmel continued, apparently oblivious to or unconcerned about the dangerous territory he was entering. "I think you've been playing this political game for years, floating trial balloons, testing the waters, all while pretending it's just speculation from other people. I think you've been building a coalition of supporters across party lines, carefully avoiding any position that might alienate potential voters. And I think that's not authentic leadership. That's political opportunism." "That's enough," Johnson said quietly, but his voice carried such weight that it seemed to reverberate through the entire studio. "You don't know what you're talking about, and you're way out of line." "Out of line?" Kimmel's voice rose to match the increasing intensity of the moment. "This is my show, Dwayne. You came here to promote your movie, but you also came here as a public figure who's been teasing a political career for years. If you can't handle tough questions, maybe you're not as ready for the big leagues as you think you are." The comparison to political inexperience struck another nerve. Johnson had always been sensitive about the criticism that celebrities had no business in politics, and Kimmel's suggestion that he was somehow unprepared for serious scrutiny was clearly hitting its intended target. "I can handle tough questions just fine," Johnson replied, his voice now completely devoid of the warmth and charm that had made him America's sweetheart. "What I can't handle is disrespect disguised as journalism." "Disrespect?" Kimmel scoffed. "You think asking you to be honest about your political ambitions is disrespectful? You think calling out the contradiction between your public image and your private calculations is crossing a line? Maybe the problem isn't my questions, Dwayne. Maybe the problem is that you've gotten so used to softball interviews and fawning coverage that you've forgotten what real scrutiny feels like." The audience was now completely silent, watching this unprecedented breakdown of late-night television decorum with a mixture of fascination and horror. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something much more primal and uncomfortable. Two alpha personalities locked in a battle of wills that was spiraling completely out of control. Johnson slowly rose from his chair, his massive frame casting a shadow across Kimmel's desk. The movement was deliberate, controlled, but unmistakably threatening. For a moment, the only sound in the studio was the hum of the cameras and the barely audible whisper of air conditioning. "You know what, Jimmy?" Johnson said, his voice now carrying the kind of quiet intensity that had made him a convincing action star. "I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between tough questions and cheap shots. I've dealt with real adversity, real challenges, real consequences. I don't need to prove anything to you or anyone else." "Then why are you getting so defensive?" Kimmel pressed, apparently determined to push this confrontation to its absolute limit. "If everything you're saying is true, if you're as authentic and genuine as your image suggests, then why can't you just answer a simple question about your political intentions without getting angry?" The question hung in the air like a lit fuse, and everyone in the studio could sense that whatever came next would determine whether this situation could be salvaged or whether it would explode into something that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. Johnson stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, his towering presence casting an ominous shadow across the entire set. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the kind of controlled fury that made everyone in the studio lean forward to catch every word. "You want to know why I'm getting defensive, Jimmy?" Johnson said, his eyes locked on Kimmel with laser-like intensity. "It's because I've spent my entire career treating people with respect, even when they didn't deserve it. I've built my reputation on being a professional, on rising above petty conflicts, on finding common ground with people even when we disagree. But what you're doing right now isn't journalism, and it isn't entertainment. It's character assassination, plain and simple." Kimmel, perhaps finally realizing he had pushed too far but unwilling to back down in front of his audience and cameras, doubled down with the reckless abandon of someone who had already committed to a path of destruction. "Character assassination?" Kimmel laughed, but the sound was hollow and forced. "Dwayne, asking tough questions isn't character assassination. What this is the first time in probably a decade that someone has challenged you to be something other than a walking, talking brand mascot. And clearly you can't handle it." That was the moment. That single phrase, walking, talking brand mascot, was the verbal equivalent of throwing gasoline on a fire. Johnson's entire body language shifted, his shoulders squaring, his stance widening into something that looked disturbingly familiar to anyone who had watched him dominate opponents in wrestling rings around the world. "You know what, Jimmy?" Johnson said, his voice now carrying a dangerous calm that was somehow more threatening than shouting would have been. "I came here tonight as a courtesy. I came here to promote a movie that provides jobs for hundreds of people, to talk about projects that matter to me, and to connect with fans who have supported me throughout my career. But instead of treating me like a guest, you've decided to treat me like some kind of target in your personal vendetta." "Vendetta?" Kimmel shot back, but for the first time since the interview began, there was a slight tremor in his voice that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had unleashed. "This isn't personal, Dwayne. This is about accountability. This is about calling out the facade." "The facade?" Johnson's voice rose for the first time, and the sound reverberated through the studio like thunder. "You want to talk about facades? Let's talk about your facade, Jimmy. Let's talk about how you sit behind this desk every night, making jokes at other people's expense, tearing down anyone who's achieved more than you have, all while pretending it's just harmless fun. Let's talk about how you've built your entire career on being mean-spirited while hiding behind the label of comedy." The accusation hit Kimmel like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and for a moment, his carefully constructed television persona completely cracked, revealing something much uglier underneath. "That's rich coming from someone who's never had an original thought in his life," Kimmel snapped, his professional composure finally abandoning him entirely. "You're nothing but a muscle-bound puppet who reads lines other people write for you. The only reason anyone takes you seriously is because you're big and you smile a lot. Take away the muscles and the fake humility, and you're nobody." The insult was so personal, so viciously calculated, that it seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Johnson's face went completely emotionless, a mask of controlled rage that was more terrifying than any display of anger could have been. "I've heard enough," Johnson said quietly, but his words carried such finality that they seemed to echo through the entire studio. "I've been disrespected by better men than you, Jimmy, and I've always found a way to rise above it. But I won't sit here and let you insult my intelligence, my integrity, and my character for the sake of your ratings." Johnson began to remove his microphone with deliberate, measured movements, each action carrying the weight of a man who had made a decision from which there would be no retreat. "Oh, so now you're going to storm off," Kimmel taunted, apparently unable to stop himself even as the situation spiraled completely beyond his control. "Is this how you handle adversity? Is this the leadership quality you want to bring to politics? Run away when someone asks you tough questions? Johnson paused. In his movements, the microphone half removed from his lapel, and looked at Kimmel with something that might have been pity. You know what the difference is between tough questions and what you're doing, Jimmy? Tough questions come from a place of genuine curiosity and a desire to understand. What you're doing comes from a place of insecurity and a need to tear down anyone who makes you feel small. And that says a lot more about you than it does about me. The observation was delivered with such devastating accuracy that Kimmel visibly flinched. For a moment his mask slipped completely, and everyone watching could see the petty, insecure man behind the late-night television persona. "I don't have to sit here and listen to this," Kimmel muttered, but his words lacked conviction. He was no longer controlling the narrative, and everyone in the studio could see it. "No, you don't," Johnson agreed, finally freeing himself from the microphone and dropping it onto his chair. "But your audience does, and they're going to remember this, Jimmy. They're going to remember how you treated a guest who came here in good faith. They're going to remember how you chose to be petty and vindictive instead of professional and respectful." Johnson turned toward the audience, and his demeanor immediately softened. The rage that had been building throughout the interview seemed to drain from his body, replaced by the genuine warmth and charisma that had made him beloved by millions. "I want to apologize to everyone who came here tonight expecting to have a good time," he said, his voice carrying across the silent studio with perfect clarity. "You deserve better than this. You deserve entertainment that lifts you up instead of tearing people down. And I'm sorry that my presence here tonight created a situation that robbed you of that." The audience, which had been frozen in uncomfortable silence throughout the confrontation, began to respond with scattered applause that quickly grew into something approaching a standing ovation. It was clear where their sympathies lay, and Kimmel's face grew even redder as he realized he had completely misjudged his audience's reaction. "Don't you dare try to turn my audience against me," Kimmel said, but his voice was weak and desperate now, the voice of a man who knew he had lost control of his own show. Johnson didn't even acknowledge the comment. Instead, he walked toward the edge of the stage with the confident stride of a man who had said everything he needed to say. But just before he disappeared behind the curtain, he turned back one final time. "You know, Jimmy, I've been in this business long enough to know that success isn't about tearing other people down. It's about building something meaningful, something that lasts, something that makes the world a little bit better. I hope someday you figure that out." And with that, Dwayne Johnson walked off the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage, leaving behind a host who sat speechless at his desk, an audience that was still applauding, and a television moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. The cameras continued rolling as Kimmel struggled to regain his composure, but the damage was done. In trying to diminish one of Hollywood's most respected figures, he had instead revealed the worst aspects of himself, creating a moment of television history that would define both men's legacies in ways neither had anticipated when the evening began.